So today I'm going to be talking to you about design and how we can be more ethical when we're looking at design of systems, products or services. So there's two of us clicking things, so if it goes a little bit awry, just bear with us. But I'm Holly. I'm a user experience designer. I work at an agency called Fjord. We're in London and across the world. We tend to work a lot on service design and with large corporate clients. So ethics is something that comes up quite a lot in who I work with and why we work with them. And also in day-to-day, we're trying to bring it more into our practice. Obviously, being a commercial designer, design is a commercial business. Sometimes we have to do things that aren't necessarily as ethical as we'd like. So what I've tried to do is put together a framework to kind of understand exactly where my boundaries are, where I think we can kind of understand our role as designers within systems. So I'm not sure how well these slides are going to come out if it's bleached a bit, but we'll just go with it. And I think for me, this is probably one of the core things about design. We are actually controlling choices, and a lot of the time we're designing decisions for people. So we often talk about seamless design, making things frictionless, as easy as possible. And actually sometimes that means we've enforced control, or we've enforced a choice on people that they didn't necessarily have beforehand. And so hopefully by the end of the talk you've got some options and some tools that I use to find out more about ethics, how you can use them as a designer or in any part of products at all. So, dark patterns is the thing that gets spoken of most when we talk about designs that's working in a bad way. Quite often this is, I think, actually done by accident. I don't think it's that people are doing things negatively. Sometimes it's that there's a business decision or the business has metrics that they need to meet, and these dark patterns or slightly dubious ways of moving through information get put in through no fault of the designer, either through inaction or just because that's kind of what's happening. But I think it's important to note that this is one type of design that we talk about as dark, but actually it's not the main thing that we can be doing, and I think we need to move away from just kind of calling this dark and actually understanding the motivations behind some of these issues that happen. And in a way, design is practical ethics, so I think if we think about it in that way, every time we make a design decision, we're actually making a choice about how people should view the world, how they can interact with it, and what they can do. And good design, or ethical design, if you want to say like white hat design, is design with the intent to do good. But when we think about things like the dark patterns, they're not necessarily designed to do bad or unethical design. Quite often it's just unintended consequences or things that happen, because ethics, it's not as simple as just yes or no. There's always a very grey area, and it's very blurred as to actually the motivation behind a decision or what even that you would see. And I think we need to start this discussion and have it in the open more than ever, probably because of the other thing that I talk about quite a lot, which is AI ethics. We have these design systems and these products that are amplified at scale across the world, and we're actually seeing a lot of those impacts happen faster and faster. And we're kind of on this roller coaster, and it's amazing all the tech breakthroughs that we've had, but actually the consequences are really starting to hurt us as a society. And we know that at this point in time, it's just going to get faster. Computers are going to get faster, AI is going to get more powerful, things are just going to continuously go and go until it's kind of slightly out of our control. And people's viewpoint on kind of this has changed massively. Over the last couple of years, we've had huge data scandals. There's been issues with Facebook, which continue. There's a new one pretty much every week. But it's actually in the public eye, which is somewhere which it never was previously. Design ethics has always been talked about, but it's not necessarily something that was discussed in public. And quite often now it's just discussed in terms of just black and white, good and bad. And what we have seen is that actually, as a society, people have become lonelier. And it's not just, we talk about a loneliness epidemic, one of the words I can't say very well. And we quite often think about that in older people, and we think about the bots and the different kind of like robots that have been put in place to actually make them kind of feel connected and communicated with, but actually it's as bad in the younger generations as well. And we've seen screen time and technology being linked to that loneliness and that feeling of disconnection. People are less satisfied, so when we think about that in terms of people expect everything to be as good as Amazon Prime and as good as Uber. And if your service doesn't meet those standards of being immediate, personalized, tailored, and exactly where I want it, it's kind of failing. And actually, people are less forgiving of that than ever before. And that's going to continue to be pervasive with the work that we do. And we're actually less productive. So we work more hours, even though we've all got things in our pockets, so that are more powerful than, I think, the computer that launched the first rocket to the moon. It's meant that we're always on, always contactable, and always available to workplaces. And that's actually made us, in a lot of ways, the automation hasn't made us more productive. It's actually made us less productive, and it's removed the boundaries between the 9-to-5 work and actually the rest of our lives. So that's why I think it's important that we start talking about it and continue that conversation and try and actually have some action. It's not that we can't keep up with technology, it's that legislation and regulation is very slow to catch up. So we're brilliant at innovating, we're great at like building new technologies, but actually thinking through those impacts and believing that people might use them for bad purposes, we're not as good at yet. So I think it's really important that actually as people working with technology, and that we, and I'm sure everyone here in this room already agrees on this, it's kind of preaching to the converted, but takes responsibility for it and actually understands exactly what we could do to people just by simple design decisions. So, now for the more practical bit. How do we actually design ethically? And for me, it's a two-way thing, and then there are 3 parts to it, so it's like a framework on a framework, obviously. So the first bit is about actually thinking through how we become both human-centered and humanity-centered. So human-centered design means that we would be looking at user-centered design processes, the way that we always do it, investigating people, making sure we're designing for their needs and that it's the best it possibly can be. Humanity-centered is looking at that at scale. So imagining what if this thing is super popular and everyone uses it, what's the worst thing that can happen? Who do I affect? Have I left a section of the world out just because I didn't necessarily consider them a core user base to begin with? And if I've used automation, what am I suggesting that people do with that spare time that they've now got back? And this, I think, is very complicated, and there's a book, Future Ethics, here, which is amazing, which you should definitely all get and read, which talks a lot about all of this. But I think this is a good point on actually the commercial nature of design as a business. If your team is incentivized to help the business grow, if your metrics are about engagement, about more clicks, more people buying things, upsell, cross-sell, all of the different metrics we're used to all of the time, you're incentivized to do that in pretty much any way that you can. I think it's something that I've come across quite often with clients when their incentives are linked to things that are not necessarily the best doesn't really sum it up, but if they're incentivized by product sales, for example, but you're trying to build a service, that service may be standalone on its own, and it doesn't necessarily need to upsell a physical product. But if they're incentivized by physical product sales, you intrinsically have to bake that into the service that you've made for them to make their metrics. And it causes these quite complicated tensions. And it's more about actually, those tensions are always going to be there as people working in a commercial context. And it's about how we actually take control of them and understand our role within them. So, if we're looking at both human-centered design and humanity-centered, if we've got everyone in the world using our piece, the first bit is designing for respect and making sure that we respect human values, human nature, and we're actually improving people. The second one is design for transparency, and that's about not letting people think that technology is magic. and that there is something there that you can understand, and not preferencing it in a way that means that people just assume that it's behind a curtain, they can't understand what's going on. And then lastly is about designing mindfully, and that's about, we seem to always be kind of going into like agile processes and making things faster, delivering fast and often, and testing and breaking things. And often that doesn't give us time to actually assess the impacts of the things that we're doing, just because we have to run so quickly to get something out within the next 2-week sprint. So the first one is design for respect. And there's a really good framework for this from indie.ie, which is a guy called Errol Balkan and Laura Kalbag, who advocate for design ethics. And this is all about a pyramid of respect. So you basically start at the bottom and work up. And the idea is that if any of those layers are broken, then you're not actually respecting people. And so you start from the human rights part, so that's about private and open software as much as possible, accessible, secure, and sustainable. So obviously sometimes if our systems aren't open source and they're not readily available, we miss that one, which is problematic. The second layer up is human effort, and actually making sure that the pieces we work on are both usable and functional and convenient and reliable. Sometimes we actually want to put a bit of friction into services, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the top layer is delightful. So quite often that gets talked about in brand sense and actually moments of delight or signature experiences. But in this sense, it's about actually improving people's lives. And this is another framework that you can use when you're doing ideation, and it's called the Moral Value Map, and it's from a website called Ethics for Designers. They've got loads of tools that you can download and use all the way from ideation up until full product delivery. It's about preferencing those human values, so they range from everything about being fair all the way up to curiosity and exploring meaningful events. You can use this just to make sure you know how what you're designing could affect either of those in good and bad ways, and then just actually understanding that and then deciding if you need to do something about it. Enhancing human potential is all about those automated systems and making sure that we always build centaur systems rather than systems that replace people. So it's about human and machine working together as much as possible. And this is an example that I really like, just coming up, of a guy who built a robot that feeds him tomatoes as he runs. So they work better together. Alone, the robot wouldn't necessarily fulfill a purpose, but actually it means that he can keep running and keep being fed tomatoes and go further and is stronger than before. So it's about technology and people working as a team rather than against each other, because we know we won't win if we fight the machines. Transparency, so this is all about making sure that people understand how a system works. And if not, we're asking them basically to believe in magic and believe that technology just works, and when it breaks down, like we've seen a bit today, we don't know what to do about it, and then we go, oh, how can we fix that? People that are doing it well are people like Everlane, so they actually build their whole business model on transparency. So it goes all the way from the cost of producing a material all the way through to the cost of shipping, so you understand the exact value of the piece that you're buying. Which I think is really interesting in terms of business models that are around. TransferWise, again, is someone who's built their business around transparency and people feeling that hidden fees are unfair. And it can come down to smaller bits as well, so it can be as small as just that 95% match that Netflix has got that actually states exactly why you're being suggested what you're doing. That builds a transparency into that algorithm and into that design that wouldn't have been there previously. Some other examples of when I didn't hit my goal on Google Fit and then it told me maybe I should lower them so that I could reach them. Yeah, desk bound a lot. And so, yeah, transparency really, you have to want it from the beginning and you have to build it into the system that you're designing. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to add in afterwards. And then lastly, is about being mindful when you design, or design mindfully. And this, I think, is probably the point to have the conversation about frictionless and seamless services. We try and make everything as easy for people as possible. And quite often we do this actually at the expense of giving them a choice. So some services and some decisions that you made, actually you should put a pause in there and add that friction before someone makes that decision. So if you think about systems like gambling tools, things like that, perhaps we should be adding more friction. We shouldn't just be making that a seamless service that you can just use. When it comes to a project, I'm whipping through because I got the 5-minute mark. There are the consideration levels that I tend to go through. So who is the project for? Do you like that brand? Do you think they're there for the good of the people? Do you believe in their mission and their vision? Hopefully yes. If not, the next question applies. What is the project? Is that project there to do good or not? And thirdly, and this is the complicated one, because you can work for people whose vision you don't necessarily believe in or align with, but the project you're doing, for example, could be about changing them and actually changing the way that they interact with the world into a much more positive one. So, for example, if you're working with energy suppliers and you could shift their business model into being about sustainable, renewable futures, that's a very worthwhile project to do, although in general maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable working for them. And then the last one, which I think is the most important, is how do you feel? And I think we quite often ignore that when we're talking about work, and we sort of hide our emotions and try and be sort of strong and commercially minded. But actually, if you feel uncomfortable, that's the most important thing for actually knowing if you are ethically comfortable with what's going on. So ethics should be an ethos, not just something you implement at one point in time or another. You should stop, think about what you're doing, consider the implications, consider if it goes as successfully as possible, what would happen, consider who you will affect, and then start designing. So it's about making sure you've got that time to pause and think. And so these are the 3 key areas again: respect, transparency, and mindfulness. So yeah, that's it from me.